Hello, YouTube. Today I'm gonna bring you the surprise episode number 9 of Exploring Every Inch of Sage. I decided to do this episode mostly on a whim, because I had multiple people actually asking about this build. So I wanted to not only try the build out a bit, but kind of just work on improving it, because I saw a lot of issues with the build. I believe that I thought were like somewhat fixable and whatnot. And I can definitely see like the beauty of this. And what we're doing today is we're doing Sage, Energy Shell Stacker, Cicada Shell. So our base setup to start off with, we're gonna have all core uniques non-corroded. Let me just quickly pull this up. We're gonna have all the core uniques in the build non-corroded. Should be noted that we're using a False God skin. We have ×3 life and ×1 energy shield on it. The combination of life and ES doesn't really seem to matter. But from my experience, like more life nodes does convert into more ES. So overall, I would recommend to try and get as many max life per highest stat on your neck as possible. But I personally bought this one because it was just really fucking cheap. Like ×3 life and ×1 ES is like way cheaper than like ×2 or ×4 of either or. We have an Omni Elixir non-corroded. The battle blend for this one is 8% armor pen. I do mention this because we do change the battle blend a few times while testing. We have a 1.4% Cicada Shell. A Magnus Scar, which we ID'd into a max roll, that was awesome. And the core concept around this build is basically this tortoise shell of distillate. So the way we're going to be scaling this build is we're going to be doing strength stacking to get as much strength as possible. And then with that strength stacking, we're going to get a ton of max life from our false gods, because our false god scales off of stats. And then we're going to convert that max life into max ES using tortoise shell distillate. And then we're going to convert that energy shield into elemental damage. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 1.4% of our ES turn into elemental damage, which is going to be fire, cold, and lightning. And then because we're doing strength stacking, all of our damage is focused on fire damage. We're then on top of that going to be converting our lightning damage into fire damage. So that 2/3 of our Cicada Shell damage is getting buffed up by like our Magnus Scar. That's basically the core idea around this build. And what makes the build so nice is that you're just playing an ES stacker. You're unbelievably tanky and kind of unkillable. Now, we're going to have full tier 1 gear with no prices gear. We have a level 90 character of an orange Phantasmagoria. So, where is it? I bought this Phantasmagoria. It was a 3x3 with 17.5 strength. And then I actually just randomly slammed it and happened to get this +1 medium talent. But even if you were to not get this, it's not that big of a deal, because you can put it on a different location where it instead hits, where instead it has more medium talents as hitting than just these 3. This build is rather point heavy, mostly because of some tech that I'm doing personally, because I do think it makes sense to go True Flame for the setup, and True Flame just does take a lot of points to spec into. As always, we're not using any inverse image, although I do think this build would gain quite a lot from an inverse image, because a lot of like the life nodes or even the strength nodes would just convert into a lot of damage. For example, if we were to inverse image this 24 strength and this max life per strength, that would just give us a ton more ES, which would be quite a lot of damage. And something niche about this build that you don't see on the target dummy is we do have 8% additional damage if you've lost life recently. Because we are using tortoise shell distillate, half of the damage we take will actually go into our life pool, which means that we will be constantly losing life. So it's very realistic to have a high uptime on this mod, even though it doesn't show up on the target dummy because we do not inflict self-damage. We're using level 40 Euro memories. I tested out 2 Euro memories. So the first one is the good old just elixir skill effect aura effect with proj speed. And I do have another Euro memory that I tested out, which is giving us an extra epic or lower origin memory, which obviously we're using then to get a second strength memory of origin. But when doing testing with it, I found the aura effect and the aura effect and the elixir effect to just be more valuable. Generally, with this mirror memory, I had higher ES pools or similar ES pools to having a second strength memory. I do believe the second strength memory was like a slight ES gain, but losing the 74% aura effect just completely killed that build. Now, all of our mirror memories do have projectile speed on them because this is a Gale build, so we will be scaling Gale. Realistically, on Memory of Progress, you want this to be movement speed, but I just happen to have the cast speed one that I've used in the previous build, so I just didn't bother buying a new one because it seemed relevant to me. But this would normally be movement speed, which this build badly needs, because in the current setup we play, we don't actually use a swiftness potion. I do think for mapping, it is worth it to equip a swiftness potion, because just mapping without it is completely awful. But for all testing, we did it with just Putrid Toad. The reason we use this is because, again, it gives us 20.5% defense, which gets scaled up a ton with our elixir effect. And then obviously the Tortoise Shell is like where we get most of our ES from. Then, of course, we're using cheap micro and medium fates. We're doing strength. Nothing too special there. Just went with strength on all the notes that made sense with strength on. We're doing full legendary pets. So the pets I chose to run with is Kitty Express, Elixir Ferris, and Firewing. Now, you might know from other people doing this build, a lot of things I've done so far you might think is wrong, or this is not how the build works. And I will get to that, and I will discuss it in a lot of detail in a bit. Then we have 3 times 2 moderate corners with decent stats. So these are my corners that I'm using. I do think this build especially is very important to get this elixir skill effect, because it does help quite a lot, especially when it's being scaled with Tailored Remedy. We have 2 times 2 moderate starlights. Now, it is important to note, we are not actually converting our fizz to fire, because most of our flat damage is just coming from the Cicada Shell, so it's not actually necessary to convert to fire damage, because we're already mostly doing fire damage. And then we have this God of Might Slate, which has the fire damage per top strength, which is why it's also more important that we try to convert as much of our damage to fire as possible. If we had access to being able to convert cold to fire, I do think this build would be significantly better. But there's no way to really do that with Sage, unfortunately. That would be like a Gemma exclusive type thing. But then obviously with Gemma, you would have significantly less elixir effect, so there's a trade-off. And we are using a 1-mod pedigree Gale. There was just no way really to fit Gale into the build. I do, in later testing, put Gale on the belt and then use a Rift Slate, because I do think Rift Slate is very powerful in this build. But that will come down later. Then we're using Special Combat Sports Tier 1 and Tier 2. So for the Swift Flight, which essentially Swift Flight is basically just Gale. This is just built-in Gale for Rain of Arrows. We are using a Tier 1 roll, because it was the same price as the Tier 2 roll. And for Payback, which makes it that our Rain of Arrows double hits, essentially, we are using a Tier 2 roll only. As well as Wind Projectiles. I couldn't really find anything that made more sense than Wind Projectiles for me. And Critical Strike damage increase. As well as a 0.3 Rhythm. Now, all the testing was done setting still, so we did not gain the benefit of this 14% additional damage on the Rhythm. And I did do that intentionally, just to make the testing more consistent. And then lastly, we're using ×2 Precise Auras. I'm using Precise Projectiles. I don't see any universe you would ever not use this skill, especially if it's going to have like 100% aura effect, because we get not only a ton of additional projectile damage, but we also get a lot of projectile speed, which is quite nice. And then from the second aura, I mulled quite a lot about what to choose for the second aura. It feels like there is no like really good option, especially because we're not converting like from fizz to fire. But I ended up choosing just the main expansion because it's just generic damage, which means that like our cold damage is getting benefited from this, as well as all the fire damage we're doing is getting benefited from this. But this does reflect slightly poorly on the dummy, due to the fact that we are never in range of 5 enemies. And as far as I'm aware, the dummy does not count as a boss monster, even though on a boss monster, the main expansion would actually be extreme powerful, which is also part of the reason why I decided to choose it. Now, with all of that being said, our base setup did 42 billion damage. So before I continue with this video, I am going to stop for a second and actually talk about the decision making around this base setup, and more specifically why I didn't do a more traditional setup. Because generally speaking, if you look at people's ES stacker builds, they will have on their pets Spirit Bless and Anthem for the 10% additional life and the 10% additional max ES. They will run a precise ES like Energy Fortress aura. Actually, let me show it to you. So we have 95k ES right now. But what a lot of people when playing this build would do is they would then equip on top of that Spirit Bless, they would equip Anthem. And they would equip Energy Shield Fortress. And they would also probably go like, what do you call it? Instead of this, they would go like a fourth hero memory. They would go strength hero memory. They would run a module Trog Mage, which is giving them like, 10% additional life, 10% additional ES. And like, well, on paper, this might sound like a very good setup. And you're going to see that my ES is going to just absolutely skyrocket right now to 140k, which is not even that much more. Realistically speaking, this setup is just so much worse because you're giving up so many multipliers all over your build for no apparent reason just to get more energy shield, and you're completely investing all of your apples in one basket of the cicada shell, which just is not how build making in this game works. It is completely redundant. And it's also the reason why a lot of times when I look at like these builds, I'm kind of unimpressed by their damage versus the amount of investment that they're putting in. Because it just doesn't really make any sense to put this much like effort and money into getting the biggest ES pool humanly possible at the cost of like losing ×5 damage multiplier, ×6 damage multiplier. Even if the extra energy shield you're getting does, in theory, you think would make up for it, it almost certainly will not, just because we are playing a build with over 100k energy shield. We already have an absolutely absurd amount of flat damage within the build. So, with all of that being said, I also tried a Magnus Law Tenacity setup. So currently, the way that the build is functioning is we are using Momentum, which half of the time this doesn't even do anything. And we're using Survival Will. Arcane just is worse than Survival Will. That's why I'm using Survival Will. But I tried a setup where instead of Momentum, we go Tenacity. We put +1 Tenacity Blessing on the belt. And then we go Magnus Laws. Now, the setup did actually have worse damage. We only had 41 billion with this setup. I do think if instead of Tenacity, if we stuck with Momentum and got Tenacity Blessings through a different means, as well as probably invest into this, it would be slightly better. But I think instead of wasting your money trying to like fit Magnus Laws in this build, because the glove slot is actually not that bad in this setup, especially because we gain a lot from Affliction effect because we're doing True Flame, as well as crit damage and critical strike rating, that you're more often than not just going to be better off saving up for Vorax gloves. With that being said, let's swap over to the Vorax glove setup. So I made a Vorax gloves on a +2 attack skill base. The max mana is irrelevant, the 5 flat damage is irrelevant. We have our Cicada Shell mod. Then we have attack crit rating. Without this attack crit rating ultimate mod here, we actually don't reach 100% crit cap, so this was actually a big boon for us. We have crit damage, which if I wanted to, I could keep rolling both this mod and this mod to strength. And I do believe that would be slightly better. But obviously that would be very expensive, and I did not see the need to like keep rolling them, even though I can safely roll both of them. And we have the Cicada Shell 15% max life and max ES, which this mod is also extremely powerful for this build because it does double dip with our setup. And then instead I use this chest, which just gives us 70% strength, which is pretty dang neat. That's pretty dang awesome. And doing this Borg's Glove setup, we are able to spike up to 80 billion. But the main issue that we're still sitting with is we're sitting with this pedigree, which is like really a sore thumb, on a build that wants to stack as many percent strength as possible. And right here, we have 1,700 strength. So the next logical step for me was to instead swap over to putting Gale on belt, which would be very expensive to do in the league start scenario, which is why I waited this long to do it. And then I equipped the Space Rift, which would also be quite expensive because it's like 2.5k FP on league launch. But the Space Rift is copying quite a lot of percent strength nodes. And thanks to that, we do go up to 2.2k strength. So we get about 500 strength from it. As well as just getting a bunch of plus levels, a bunch of good modifiers. And we only now need one mod, one convert 50% to convert all of our lightning damage to fire damage. Which is a pretty nice boon. And with this setup, we reached 145 billion. And then lastly, the thing I felt would make sense to test would be to swap in a priceless cane, just to see how much of a power spike this is. We do gain roughly, how much do we gain? We gain roughly like 65% additional damage. Maybe a bit more. Like we're up against 70% additional damage by equipping a priceless weapon. And we skyrocket all the way up to 250 billion by equipping this cane. It does have 8% additional projectile damage, which is a very underrated mod because it's actually very cheap, generally speaking. And especially on League Start, it's pretty realistic to get this plus another mod on like your cane. And of course, you know, this build lacks armor pen, so getting some armor pen is nice. We do have some fire pen, but actually we could also use some elemental pen. Because we gain 6% fire pen from this micro talent. Which, that's kind of it. There's no other like reductions of enemies elemental res in this build. So it is actually one of the few cases where I think armor pen is probably one of the weaker options we could have gotten. I did just roll RNG, like completely random, whatever we hit first we hit. But I do believe Elite Pen would have been slightly better and attack skill levels would have been slightly better for just our current gear level. Later on that wouldn't be relevant though, because once you get a Priceless Shield, you know, whatever you didn't get from your Priceless Cane, you would just get on your shield instead to balance things out. And yeah, with that setup we got to 250 billion, which is the current setup you see on your screen. It's actually a very, very powerful setup. I'm quite satisfied with it. And, oh, I think we have something wrong. And then, lastly, I did a non-true flame setup on this build. So something else. Okay, something else seems to still be wrong. We're lacking quite a bit of damage, or it could just be that we're not reloading the area. And then, obviously, I did one last test. I want to test that instead of going into True Flame, it doesn't make any sense at all to go into the Onslaughter tree, which the Onslaughter tree is quite a powerful tree. It gives us percent max life. It gives us a lot of flat percent damage. It gives us percent defense. And it gives us 24% strength. So with this setup, our strength actually went up to 2.4k. And then I just used Focus Strike because I felt like well-matched wouldn't be very fair to compare with. So I instead swapped in Focus Strike. And because we don't have Paralyze in the build, I did use a Red Umbrella instead of the Fire Wing, because we obviously don't need the Affliction effect. But even so doing that, we had about half our damage with 133 billion of this setup. And this is still the Priceless One, like, Space Rift setup. After seeing that, I didn't bother to continue testing it, because to me at least, it seemed clear that you definitely want to do True Flame scaling if you want to do this setup. Which is generally the case if you do strength stacking in any build, where True Flame just elevates the build significantly. But that's going to be it from me. This was my ES Stacker video that I did not expect to make, but I'm quite happy I did make it. I guess I'll finish it off by doing a quick mapping showcase. Now, I personally am going to lose some energy shield to equip Swiftness to, because I just am not a believer in mapping this game without swiftness too, and I don't think you need the extra damage for profound. But as you can see, like losing tailored remedy, as well as losing like the elixir effect from this memory, just halved our ES pool. So instead of having 96 billion, 96k ES for mapping, we only have 40k. Which is kind of the issue that you're gonna run into with this build, unfortunately. Now the issue you're gonna run into is because we are playing a Rain of Arrows setup. Our clear is actually not gonna be the greatest because we're not using a track medium. Oh wow, our damage is just completely miserable. We might have to do this map without swiftness, unfortunately.
Not again. You are just like
I'm personally not a fan of this setup. I don't know what else to tell you. Honestly, we could try instead of Putrid. We could try swiftness. Yeah, this seems much worse. Not having Putrid is just so much defense loss.
I promise I'll explore every ounce of your I'll maximize your potential.
Yeah, it's rough. You kind of just have to accept the fucking snail life, unfortunately.
Let's remove it from the test group and move on.
I think this build is really interesting for like being able to essentially do the same things as like Life Stacker or as a what's the other build called? You can do the same things as like what you would do on Life Stacker, or you can do the same things as you would do on a Mana Stacker, where it's like being absurdly tanky and being very good at doing bossing. But it definitely doesn't like fit my playstyle. I know I already released the tier list video where I like ranked all 8 builds. I would probably put this like 1 tier. I would put this like 1 tier. I'd probably put this in the same tier as like Mana Sacker. Like this would be like a solid C or like a D tier for me. I see the potential in the build. I see the funniness of the build. I think the nicheness of this build is just having like a massive ES pool in the end game, like being able to be like, oh, I have 1 million energy shield, or I have 5 million energy shield. If you could fully invest into energy shield, but as like an actual build, I think the build's not very well rounded. And if you do make the build well rounded, you're still stuck just running around mapping at 36% movement speed. Realistically, if you have a movement speed memory, this is like 70%. I do think in endgame you would, instead of like this memory, you would use like the revival variant of this setup. And with red rare memories, like I could definitely see the build feeling a bit more complete in like a higher budget once you can fit in like a swiftness deal, or you can fit in a mobility skill. But until then, I'm not super duper interested in the setup myself. So it was fun to make this. I'm actually quite happy with what I made, and I'm quite happy with like the way I approached it, because I think the setup would have ended up like another Life Stacker scenario, where I'm just wholly disappointed in the build, because all I did was invest into one stat. And in this game, if you invest into only one stat, it will never work out, unless you throw enough F at it to where all of your problems get solved by money. So, with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all again next time. Bye-bye. Bye, YouTube.